Good morning. Uh, good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you all with us today. I'm Dr. Kayla C. Elliott. I am the Director of Higher Education Policy at the Education Trust, and I'm joined by three of my amazing colleagues who I'll kick it to introduce themselves, and we'll hop right into talking about our new Justice State Level Toolkit. Alexa?
Hi, I'm Alexa Garza. I am based out of Dallas, Texas. I am a certified Braille transcriber and a Justice Fellow. So thank you for the opportunity and welcome.
William.
Hello, everyone. I'm William Freeman. I am also a Justice Fellow and a recent new hire here at Ed Trust as the Manager of Higher Education Justice Initiative. Happy to be here with
you. And on to Jared.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Jared Wall, originally from Indiana. I am a Justice Policy Fellow, and I'm currently in New Orleans, Louisiana, and a PhD student at Tulane University.
Thank you all. And so William's going to tell you all a bit about our Justice Fellows program.
Yes, so I'm back. So happy to introduce the Justice Fellows program to everyone. This was a cohort made up of 8 individuals selected out of more than 450 applicants, all of which have system involvement in their past. So these folks were able to use their lived experience as formerly incarcerated students to inform, review, and amplify and reflect on EdTrust policy recommendations for justice impacted students. And then I want to give a special shout out to this cohort. And I don't just say that because I was a part of them, are the official Justice League. You'll find that out real soon. And the advisory board, I don't want to leave them out. I definitely want to give them a shout out. The advisory board is made up of 15 individuals who are also system impacted or advocates or people who want to see change working in this process to select. So I definitely want to give them a shout out. And I will shoot it back to Kayla.
Thanks, William. So let's get into our toolkits for advancing college opportunity for justice impacted students. So as many of you know, Congress recently lifted the ban on incarcerated students being able to use Pell Grants. So for about the last almost 30 years, as a part of the 1990s crime bills, students who had previously been able to access Pell Grants while they were incarcerated they had that ability taken away from them. And so we'll see that restored to them within the next year or two, hopefully, fully through the Department of Education and financial aid. But we do know that there are many barriers that exist at the state level. Far too often, students are kept out of state level financial aid and the various state systems and state supports necessary in order for folks to re-enter. So we designed an equity framework based on 8 different metrics in 8 different states. That's California, New York, Michigan, Tennessee, Illinois, Ohio, Louisiana, and Texas. We selected those states because we wanted this toolkit to really be put to use. And we have networks either of our own EdTrust regions or deep relationships with folks on the ground in those states who are education advocates or advocates in the justice space. We really wanted to design a toolkit of resources that would be useful to them. And so there are 8 different pieces, a letter from the fellows, an introduction, gloss, and yeah, we'll click through pretty quickly. An introduction from myself. We thought it was really important to start with a letter from the fellows introducing this work because they were so integral in putting it together. Each state the data was collected and the subsections were authored by 1 or 2 of the fellows and teams. So we're really glad to see them, and you'll see them all at the bottom. Moving on to the introduction, just to ground the work and its importance and what it means for higher education and prison programs and for the individuals and families that are impacted by incarceration. We also included a glossary. We think it's super important to define and use words that are respectful and people-centered. And so we will say, a person who is formerly incarcerated, a student who is currently incarcerated, what we mean by state financial aid, sentence reduction credits, and the streamlined process for identification. And we'll get into that later. And then each of the states has a state level toolkit. This one in Illinois was put together by one of our analysts and one of our former interns earlier this year, very clearly just spelling out what's actually happening on each of the 8 metrics. Finally, we have recommendations for each of the 8 metrics as well, and we'll talk through those with you all a little later. And there's a few other resources for each state. One is the State Decision-Making Agency and Organization Tracker. This one is for Tennessee. And so we looked at both public and nonprofit organizations who are movers and shakers, essentially. And thank you to Jordan. She's dropped in the chat the link to the full toolkit so you can check out all 8. There is one per state. And so this is just our assessment of where these folks are tracking. Green, if they have been a supporter on the record or involved in like THEI, providing actual credits at credit varying courses inside of prisons, working in advocacy around a lot of the issues that we've happened, or the Tennessee Secretary of State, who's done some really detrimental things. And we have one of those in each state. And that's followed by this section, which can actually be filled in either, of course, by hand, printed off and by hand, or if you click on it in each of the toolkits, you can actually continue some of the tracking at each state level. So this becomes a real toolkit in the beginnings of a power map for coalitions on the ground to use. We have a blog and op-ed tool from our communications team walking through how do you pitch, how do you pull together arguments, and we also have a list of resources nationally around the 8 various issues that we talk through. So let's get into the metrics. There are 8 key metrics, and I'll walk through those pretty quickly to tell you what we found, and then kick it to the fellows to zero in on the 3 states that they looked at. So first, state financial aid to currently and formerly incarcerated students. While the Pell ban has been lifted, we know that each state has the power to decide which of their citizens qualify for their state financial aid. And all too often, currently and formerly incarcerated students have many barriers. That might be an outright no, you do not qualify, like in Ohio, or it might be a yes, you qualify for some, but not for others. You qualify, but not if you have these certain types of convictions. You qualify, but only in a certain number of years or after a certain number of years. And so it varies quite a bit state to state, particularly for currently incarcerated students. So for example, in California, the main scholarship state level financial aid grant currently incarcerated students cannot use, but the community college grant can be used. And there's about 14,000 students who are using that. And from what I know from folks on the ground, they encourage them to use that to attend instead of their Pell Grant eligibility so that they can use their Pell Grant after release. Sentence reduction credit. This one, I think, really speaks to the importance of why this was a fellow-led project and why fellows, the advisory board members, and other folks who are formerly incarcerated, it was really integral to have them guiding this work, because this whole entire metric was not on our radar. When we first put together, okay, let's think about state financial aid, let's think about some other metrics. This one was actually super important, and the idea of some of the directly impacted folks that we work with, specifically in Michigan, where we actually saw by vote a ban on the ability to receive sentence reduction credits as they would for other activities, right? But we see that most states have it. Unfortunately, Michigan and Texas do not. So incentives and resources to colleges that enroll and support for currently and formerly incarcerated students. This one is super important. States can do what they want to do and find the means to do in order to encourage institutional behaviors, right? So most of my research is around outcomes-based funding. In Wisconsin, they specifically have a metric that says, if you enroll these students, the more of these students that you enroll and like graduate, we will give you funding, right? We will incentivize that. And so we were careful to look for that across states, whether that was grants to institutions, grants to institutions, we saw that quite a bit, or in California, they have grants to programs like Project Rebound, Underground Scholars, which are student support groups and student success groups that provide a lot of services to folks on campus. So definitely, and in Tennessee, I think pretty uniquely, there is a state staff member, right, who works at the state level that is specifically a point of contact for all the higher ed and prison programs and serves as a resource to them. So definitely some bright spots here. A streamlined process for ID. I think this is super important, and I know one or more of the fellows will talk about this. What we mean, and we were careful to identify this and define this in the glossary. What we mean by a streamlined process is that they actually leave the facility with their birth certificate, social security card, state driver's license, or ID, because that sets them on a path to not have to navigate transportation and other obstacles in order to be able to get to an office, to be able to find the cost of like a replacement ID or different things, like ensuring that folks leave the facility with that so that they then have the necessary information to enroll in college and to receive other reentry supports. Access to basic needs like food, housing, and healthcare. This is, of course, only for formerly incarcerated students. We saw many yes buts, and that's where you see our asterisks. Yes, you are eligible for SNAP. That's most of the states pretty much provided access there. Housing was definitely a bit more of a challenge. And I know William has done another fellowship around housing, and we'll speak more about this. Again, a yes, but except for these types of convictions, or yes, if available. And Jared has some good takeaways on how that's done in Louisiana, and things appearing to be open at the state level, but some of the district and parish level decisions impacting access as well. And finally, on to ban the box. I'm actually going to kick it to Jared Wall to walk us through the last three.
Yeah, thank you, Kayla. Yeah, it's interesting with ban the box. So in Louisiana, it's been passed for both universities, state universities, as well as for employment, state employment. And but the important thing is it wasn't just given. And I think this is what we need to really focus on, realize that this was an effort of advocacy, and it was advocacy that was led by formerly incarcerated individuals. So they're the ones that knew the problem, and they're also the ones who, worked to solve it. We know, for instance, with the box, which is, for those of you who don't know what the box is, it's the questions on applications on criminal legal history. A lot of people, you just check no and go on. You don't even think about it if that doesn't affect you. However, whenever you check a box, let's say for university, a whole nother process begins. And what they find is the Center for Community Alternatives out there in the SUNY system, they did research on this and found that when formerly incarcerated or directly impacted individuals get to a college application where the box is there, 2 out of 3 just stop right there. So it's not only is the process itself, the further stage is prohibitive, where universities might just exclude individuals with a criminal legal background, but just having the box in and of itself has what they call a chilling effect. In other words, it just has attrition, weeds people out right there, unfortunately. But yeah, just want to emphasize that it has taken work for individuals to get this changed. But it also shows, I think, the same way we got the Pell Grant back, the same way in Louisiana here, how they have the vote for formerly incarcerated individuals also, again, because it was another work of advocacy. The vote down here is kind of similar to what we ran into with Pell Grant. We had directly impacted individuals kind of lead the initiative, but then it also took people who were not directly impacted as well. So I think any of these coalitions we have, privileged and marginalized, need to come together to really have larger scale effects. Okay. So yeah, as we can see here, just the stats there for those who are currently incarcerated. You could just see the end, the no all the way down, formerly incarcerated. Yes, to several here, except for Tennessee. But again, it'd be interesting to know the history in other places. I know in Indiana, I was released, could vote, never even thought about it. Then when it's down here, maybe appreciate the vote even more just because the people who had fought and won it. Okay. So kind of want to make a last comment here with Louisiana. When it comes to the housing, we found it was really interesting that it just, not only does it vary from state to state, but what we ran into down here is the housing issues differed from parish to parish, which is county to county. Um, again, advocacy had been done around the New Orleans area that opened up more housing opportunities for formerly incarcerated. But some of the housing lists, they weren't even taking applicants because they were so backed up that they're not even taking new people to sign up. But again, it's a really, if you're going to be an advocate in this area, you just really have to explore and find out the ground level reality. All right, Kayla, back to you.
Yep, over to Alexa.
Hi. So my state is Texas. I'm a Texas girl. And what really stood out to me when doing the policy scans was the policies that I was reading versus the actual practice, which were evidently not policy. I had just been released within 3 years. And if reading up on state financial aid for those inside the prison had like 8 or 9 different programs and available grants and resources, but I had never heard of them. And I was the one taking classes. So that was surprising. And it was very difficult when doing a Texas scan to get statistics. They are non-existent. We reached out to the DOC, we reached out to state organizations, and no one had basic statistics on higher education, even simple statistics like number of students enrolled, number the gender numbers or such. So a lot of the Texas scan was missing pieces. We found that it was a lot like Kayla and Patrick and William have already stated. The questions were not a simple yes or no. It was yes and no, but if you fall under this crime, if you fall under this stipulation, if you fall under this limitation. So it was very ambiguous. It was very difficult. And I found that very surprising because it's written one way, but the actual practice and implementation is something totally different. So I would really like to explore that a little bit more. But speaking from my personal experience in Texas, as a woman getting her higher education in the South, it was very difficult, just the disparity between women and men, the gender roles. I wasn't able to access certain educational programs that are successful and robust, but if I was a man, it would be no problem. And, you know, I mean, in this day and age, really, you're still kind of using my gender against me. So this was other things that I found just interesting, and like reading and hearing William's take on New York on their robust, successful, like collegiate program in that aspect. It just really inspired me that there is still a lot of work to do in Texas. And I'm just anxious to get it started, or at least have a conversation or discussion on when we can improve it, because it is very, very important. Even as something is getting an ID, the process and the policy reads, yes, we provide them with IDs. However, in reality, if you are a divorced woman and you're under your husband's name, it's difficult for them to find you. It's difficult for them to issue one. Or if you were born out of state, it's just another loophole that, oh, we don't want to go through that trouble. So let's get back to basics and start tackling some of these things. Now that I know that it can be done in other states, now that I know that it is successful, we can just start the conversation and like get the party started. I'm eager to start and eager to learn more. So it was just a challenge in and of itself and a surprise when I started reading what reality versus practice was. That was just like the biggest one that stood out for me, and that I can't just say enough, because if you want to know how it really is, talk to me, because I can tell you. So that was it, but I will pass it to William to speak on New York.
Thank you, Alexa. And doing the scan of New York, what was interesting is New York is my birthplace. So the way I had thought of New York as this mosaic land of opportunity is very confusing when you look at it from a policy scan. And I see that Mary is in attendance. Mary Baxter is the fellow who led this. I worked alongside her, if I'll be honest. And what we saw with the state of New York is that, on one hand, there are these really robust pushes for new legislation. May 4th, 2021, Andrew Cuomo, he signed into effect that you could come home, you could vote, right? So you see that happening on one hand, and you're thinking, wait, you pair that with some of its previous push for legislation around work for success, like getting individuals who are system impacted back into the workforce. However, it was confusing because New York does not have a streamlined process to get identification. And what we know about that process, not just a streamlined, a process for individuals to get identification, if I personalize, if you're on parole and probation, especially I know this from, I live in Baltimore, Maryland. If you're on parole and probation and you don't have an ID, a state issue ID, and you are stopped for whatever reason, it's really easy to be thought to be someone else. If you're stopped and asked for an ID and you don't have it, that's a potential opportunity to have a ride back to the holding cell, which could potentially trigger a technical violation. So we see the ways that these archaic processes that are here now need to be redone. I mean, honestly, this has taken its root right from slavery, not having freedom papers, not having a place where you come from. So that's important. It was also interesting to me that your crime could get you excluded from certain benefits, certain housing. So we know like some work around housing in New York. New York was really out front, progressive in some of its push around NYCHA, which was a program to get formerly incarcerated or system impacted people reunited with their families who were living in Section 8 housing. However, certain crimes, and even if you have been found guilty of, I believe it was fraud, if you were found guilty of fraud with living in Section 8 housing before, you could be disqualified, right? Also, with ban the box, New York does not have a across the state ban on the box for state colleges. It also has a ban the box for state employees, but again, that's concerning because that's only in a few areas in New York. That again, that is not across the entire state. So you go through and again, ban the box allows for an employer to take you through the hiring process to get you where you are a great candidate for the position, to potentially even get you started for the job, and then the background can happen. Once they let you know, the background can happen. Um, Currently incarcerated people don't have the right to vote in New York. And what we mean to say about that is like, when I looked at that and to what's happening in reality in Baltimore, as long as you're pretrial and you have not been sentenced, you can vote here in Baltimore, Maryland, right from prison, right from the jail, as long as you have not been found guilty of the crime. And then once released, now again, we talked about Kumo signing into law May 4th, 2021, the ability for individuals to vote. But here's the problem with that, right? How do we get individuals who don't have identification, who don't have vital records, who don't have money for transportation down to vote, right? So it's another issue. We could go to the next slide, please. And so some of the policy recommendations that came out of the toolkit and we came up with is like we're saying all barriers to state financial aid. If we mean to put individuals back on a footing where they can become sustainable in their own agency, then we need to remove those barriers and allow students to earn equivalent good time credit. So again, this was a thing that we saw with the New York scan. Certain crimes can get it. Certain convictions could get good conduct or good time credit off your sentence for being involved in educational programs, while others could not. And it really was condescending because the ones who were not eligible for credits, they could receive additional visits or additional perks, but still behind the wall. And we're asking that provide resources to institutions that enroll justice impacted students. And that is open up the school and all of its wealth to these individuals. What does that mean? Assistance filling out FAFSA, like free. I know when I got out and I transferred to the main campus, I was allowed to get free therapy sessions. Like, and I was protected by HIPAA. I was informed of that. I was allowed to get a certain allotment of food before I had to sign up for a food plan. So if these things are offered at the school for traditional college students, they should be opened up to system impacted students. We're asking to implement this streamlined process for incarcerated students for IDs. It is a must. An ID is not just about higher education. An ID is about sustaining your freedom. And then we ask that allow eligibility for state and federal support such as food, housing, and health care. Like I understand HUD only controls for Kayla kind of gave the precursor to this, but HUD excludes two, right? Sex offenders and if you are found guilty of manufacturing methamphetamines while living in a HUD property. Now, even those become problematic because if we control for those, then that will be a growing population of folks who at some point will need housing as well. So this goes back to rescinding those barriers. Ban the box in private colleges and universities on applications. And then we ask that you ban the box on private job and public employers, that they should ban that as well. And then allow currently and formerly incarcerated, I can't see the bottom. Can you scroll up a little bit? Yeah, no, it's like cut off. I have it up too. I cannot see the bottom. The right to vote, right, which was returned to New York. Thank you, Jordan. And we go to the next slide. And at Trust, we want to put this out there. And I'm not just I could just read it from the slide. I could personalize this also. Ed Trust is dedicated to supporting state advocates and using these scans and resources to advance these issues in the states. Ed Trust has decided to put some resources behind some individuals based on their lived experience and their knowledge in that right. In addition to that, and I have to mention this, what was groundbreaking with the Ed Trust application for the fellowship, it required or it was looking for individuals who had less than, and I underscore that, less than 2 years experience in policy. What we've seen with opportunities is that that is a gatekeeping process that keeps individuals out because it requires more than 2 years of experience. And then we support the capacity. This support capacity includes Kayla had lined it out, the digital toolkits, media strategy and pitching, review of policy scan for stakeholders, and organizing strategies. We can go to the next slide. And I want to send this back over to Kayla.
Thank you to Alexa, Jared, and William for covering all of our recommendations, metrics, and giving us a spotlight on Texas, Louisiana, and New York. We have seen lots of questions coming in through the chat, and we are happy to answer those in the remaining time that we have left. So we'll get started, but please feel free to drop others in the chat, whether that is about the fellowship, about the toolkit, or about any specific states or follow-up things that we've mentioned. So it looks like we have a question around additional things that weren't included, other restrictions and barriers that formerly and currently incarcerated students are facing, specifically currently incarcerated students are facing that are not included in the scan. So in addition to the 8 that we looked at, what other metrics and considerations about state level barriers are there?
The digital divide, if I could jump right in. So much of prison is still very much from paper pen. And so what that does is that excludes students from having access to a sea of information that they could use to better themselves as students. In addition to that, that requires college staff to have to log in books. Oftentimes, those books take up space, and in prison, I don't know about anywhere else in the world, but in Maryland, even your school books, whenever an officer wants to retaliate for whatever reason and do a cell search, they had a box. It was about 11 by some odd inches big, and they'll put all of your books and papers into that box. Anything that does not fit in that box gets sent home. So I have been a part of a process where students were having their books sent home for school, and then those books would have to be sent back in or carried back in. And again, an officer could just use that as a tool. So the digital divide is one of such barriers.
I would say for my personal in Texas is a reentry support in general, mental health, that trauma, employment, education opportunities. There is not a lot of reentry support in my state, and I found that that's a lot of barriers just to find basic. How do you open a bank account? How do you get a license? Do you have to make an appointment? Back in the day, you would have to go. You could actually go to the DMV and stand in line. Nowadays, you have to make an appointment. Proof of insurance, proof of ID, basic things that you don't think about that they don't prepare us for. Where that's everybody's taking it for granted that everyone knows this or that it's readily accessible, and it's not. So that's something that we could always focus on more.
Yeah, I go ahead, Kayla. Do you have a?
I was
Okay,
just
yeah, there's
asking you to
several.
hop in.
Okay, yeah, no, several points I could make. I mean, that Williams' point on the digital divide's great, and this affects research materials too. Okay, I mean, how many references will someone out here have on the campuses, on site campuses in a paper, let's say a student versus inside? The books are one thing, having the access to the books. I remember one time during the lockdown, all my college books were confiscated for the very reason William's saying. And remember the lieutenant laughing, saying, "Oh, this one wants to be a scholar." So those are problems we run into. But then also, digitally, do individuals have access to the library? Do they have like a JSTOR abstracts at least they could look at? But what's the process for additional research materials? Secondly, a problem that I'm looking at is basic cost of attendance inside. One of the things we run into is a lot of times student wage is very low and worker wage is more. And so there is a cost of living inside. Living in prison is not free. A lot of people don't realize that. Mass incarceration, they foisted more and more of the expenses upon individuals. And we just run into, unfortunately, different times that people can't afford to be a college student inside. And this is this is known among people who do the work. There's been different remedies sought, incentive pay, graduated pay, etc. But again, as we're getting ready to have more and more programs proliferated throughout the nation, let's try to take care of some of these problems before they happen versus basically repeating them and then have to try to change them down the road. Lastly, I just want to say, Kayla put in the chat here, we ran into a problem in Louisiana. So you would think it'd be really simple to get data like, hey, what college programs are in what prisons? We could never get one site that had this. We talked to the director of education for DOC, not to say anything bad about anyone there, but I mean, that individual didn't even know, or we never got a list from that individual even. So we ended up, Tro and I, we had Montreal Carmouche, we had to start calling people. We had to find out about certain policies. We had to call in individual instructors at certain prisons from a certain program and started getting information basically from the very ground up, and then had to start building the larger view.
And then I want to lift up Rabia Khattab is also one of our inaugural Ed Trust Justice Fellows, and is sharing some of her experience with collecting data and some answering the questions in the chat, and has said the streamlined process for immigrants and undocumented folks is particularly difficult, right? For them to be able to have documents and identification. And then also a lack of access for documents for integrated health. Accessible support and integrated health is seen in some states, which was not included in the scan, but is very important for sure. And then would definitely think through, just double down on what Jared shared around the difficulty of accessing information. So I think Trell and Alexa are unique amongst the fellows, I believe, because they were incarcerated in the states where they collected data. And so we see firsthand, like Alexa is able to say, like, this is policy, but this is practice. This is what actually happened. This was my experience. And we're able to learn from both of those things together. And that's been super powerful. But then Trell, both having been incarcerated in Louisiana, and working in a reentry organization in Louisiana, actually like spoke to the difficulty of if someone did not have the resources of Operation Restoration like Montreal does, or Ed Trust like the rest of the fellows did, to be able to just find information about how to get an ID, to be able to just find information about where programs are, about if they even qualify for a housing benefit, right? Like if with the resources of these organizations and all the others that fellows are attached to from their different work and coalition, it was still that difficult to find that information. We can only imagine how difficult it would be for folks who didn't have those supports. Because like Jared said, we were making phone calls to people that Trail knew, right, from their experience, not anything that was accessible via website. When they were asked the Department of Corrections for a list of programs, there was said silence, right? Like, so there are real challenges with data and transparency and access for sure. Looks like we have a question about access to programs different based on gender, and is there data on this? Again, great point around like the difficulty of even being able to find information on where programs are located, the facilities that programs are located in. But we do know that the Alliance for Higher Ed in Prison has a pretty thorough directory, national directory, that breaks down the institutions and the facilities they're in. So I'm not sure that there is a national data set that says the number of programs and the types of programs based on the gender of the facility, but there's certainly a need for one. There's another question about restrictions for formerly incarcerated students' eligibility for work study at the federal and institutional levels. I don't know the answer to that, but definitely something for us to look into. And super curious about whether that would be, I think works, but also for currently incarcerated students, right? Like, I know Jared was working and running a program when he was incarcerated. Yeah. William, did you want to share a bit around the monetary concern?
Yeah, I could, which is a total barrier to people re-entering society. So if an individual, case in point, I served 21 years and worked in a shop where I was able to earn about $80 or $90 a month. So I saved up money. So what happens is, here in Baltimore anyway, when you're released, you're not given that money. You're given about $35, and that money goes to the comptroller. What occurred was once the money is released from the comptroller, it is done so after deductions are made from that money. So an individual may not even get the full amount that they saved up with plans to use it. So again, that's something that's not in the toolkit, but it is an ask of the formerly incarcerated community. If I owe a debt, if I'm being returned my rights as a citizen, then that responsibility, a part of that responsibility is that I need the system to know if prison is working, then I'll pay my bills. Give me my money. Let me be able to move when I get out. Again, um, and for me, that was a few $1,000s. So I had plans. I was like, I'm gonna get a car. I'm gonna be able to pay someone to let me lay on that couch. And those plans changed, and I end up sleeping in a woman's office with the desk moved over and on a blow up mattress and it took about 90 days, about three and a half months to get access to that money after it had been reduced.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, I just want to say one of the things that sticks out to me more so than right now is like the quality of education being offered inside. It differs from collegiate system in the states to the regions. So what kind of quality of education are we offering? Just because Pell is being implemented and new players are entering the field, let's not, let's set the bar high, not for predatory practices and people just coming in because we're talking money now. And in Texas, that is a concern. that I'm specifically seeing and hearing, and we're all waiting to see how this rolls out. But quality of education is very, very important, especially when you have some systems that have been just getting by doing the bare minimum and been doing it for years. So here we are, and now that Pell is getting, so that's one of a concern that we just all need to keep on the forefront of our minds as well.
Yeah, just in closing, I just have a three quick points, and really exactly what Alexa's saying there. I mean, the Pell's coming back. We're looking at what 400,000 currently incarcerated individuals are going to be eligible to receive Pell and receive an education. So as we're starting to initiate these programs, we need to look at these barriers. We need to look at what's already been said that are problems, and let's don't replicate them. As we're starting new programs, let's do it right. Secondly, look at when I mentioned with Louisiana, how much difficulty we had getting just basic information, what programs at what prisons. So this is, when we're looking at data, this is just a nightmare. So, this is just even what programs exist, let alone what data are they keeping so we can track to make sure these are quality programs. So basically, there's a lot of talk of other than recidivism, we need to look at, establishing consistent, comparable, across the board data infrastructure. And then lastly, I just want to say that these are, I know William says a lot of times that, hey, this is just a start, this policy scan. I put in the chat earlier, state and national, there are 44,000 collateral consequences for those with criminal legal histories. 44,000. Okay. Collateral consequences are those basically restrictions that are outside of the court's judgment, of the court sentencing. So this is your housing. This is all the things we're talking about: housing, we're talking employment, etc. It's 70% of these, however, deal with employment. So, there's a lot of room outside of this policy scan. This is the beginning, and just encourage everyone to be looking for more metrics that they can add to our list, their list, everyone's list.
Thank you, Jared. I will pass it to Alexa and then William for their final thoughts as well.
To echo what Jared said, it's a good start for a discussion on how we can improve and how we can stay informed. Transparency needs to be key in these, transparency between the DOC, Department of Education, the systems involved, so that we can have a better understanding, oversight, post-incarceration support, wraparound services. That is a big one, especially speaking from Texas, it's non-existent. So there is still a lot of work to be done, but I am eager and positive that, change is possible, and that, we need to have our voices at the table. And if they won't let us at the table, we need to make our own. So I'm just anxious and grateful for the opportunity, and let's see what's to come. And I will pass it to William.
Thank you, Alexa. I just checked the participant box, so it seems like I would be preaching to the choir to go off, right? But definitely want folks to know, like Jared was saying, while we're at the beginning, we also at some point need that piece to be bold, right? We need the policy that we need to pass to be bold. And this is something that I've been speaking about here in Baltimore, where policy goes through a process and generally loses its teeth. We as advocates have to be comfortable in the fight to know I'd rather lose than have something passed that has no teeth. There's a great deal of policy here in Baltimore that reach really well on the face, but you cannot find the individuals who is benefiting. So the call to action is for folks to engage with the formerly incarcerated and incarcerated community. We are people just like everyone else. What you will find is that most of us have only this small piece of error in our lives, and beyond that have done some really great things in the community. So that's my call to action, is if you don't know anyone outside of who's on this call who is system involved, and there's over 73 million people with criminal records in this country. If you don't know anybody like this, sit down and have a conversation, because we understand just like much of what people of color had to understand previously, we're definitely playing twice as nice, attempting to work twice as hard.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. My closing thoughts are just to stress a point that I made earlier, and that each of the fellows has both like said and shown you all, is the importance of having folks who are directly impacted in leadership and power sharing, as William always points out, when you are conducting projects like this, and the equitable and fair compensation of those folks for their labor, right? I think the fellowship has been a give and take relationship, and mutually like reciprocal and beneficial in so many ways. We shared quite a bit around advocacy, policy, higher ed and prison, various readings and different things that we were able to share with the fellows. And in turn, they shared with us their lived experience and their expertise as advocates. And it has been tremendous for how this project developed and what the toolkit became, but also for informing EdTrust policy agenda. So all the folks sitting at national organizations like EdTrust and in positions like mine, I definitely encourage you to work with those who are closest to the problem, because they are definitely closest to the solution as well. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Please reach out. The link to the toolkit is posted, but please reach out via email, and you can reach each of us on the website for sure. Thank you so much.